We're now going to hear from Laetitia van Haren. She's from France. She spoke on the panel for Women and Girls Human Rights, United Nations Language and Terminology at the recent UN NGO CSW Virtual Forum. She's a cultural anthropologist and international development and human rights advisor, also president of SAFA, Smart Access to Health for All. So welcome, Laetitia. Can you tell us about why you signed the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights?
I just will tell you that our first application is especially for women. It is called Jambo Mama, connecting pregnant women with healthcare providers. So just to know what my main activity is in the field of helping women on the ground to get their rights and to have a better life. So the reason I signed up is because it's just a way of getting back to the basics. And for me, it seems that we are running ahead and abandon good causes simply because we tire of them, or we are in for something new, or the social media and everything feels that we have to go on. And this is while the cause at hand has not been tackled at all or to full satisfaction. Women and girls are still in the most appalling state of oppression and neglect in too many places. And it's in too many mainstream situations, and it's not because they feel like women, but because they are women. And this is a very important difference to make. They are women in biological sense. If you want to see the whole litany of impacts on women because they are biologically women, up to far into the 21st century, you could read the book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. You will then see that it's about male bias in tech design, in architecture, in policy, in security, in transportation, in data collection, in healthcare. You name it, it's there. So let's fight this erasure from public speech and administration of the very term women for biologically born women. A woman's rights are sex-based for me, and they are not gender-based. One of the key rights of a woman are that she doesn't have to be very feminine or sexually attracted to man to be a woman. She just is one, period. So that's important for me, and that's why I signed this declaration.
Thanks, great. Can you tell us about your concerns about UN language and terminology and how it might undermine the rights of women and girls?
Well, the original purpose of the gender theory, mind my words, I say theory and not ideology. The original purpose of the gender theory was to explain unequal access of women to the fruits of social, economic, and human development. And it was, in fact, Margaret Mead, an anthropologist, who studied the behavior, the grooming of boys and girls for their sexual roles, for their sexually determined, what they then coined the gendered roles, which was laid the basis, as it were, for our understanding of the gender theory as in support of understanding the woman's subordinate position. But so that was the original purpose of the gender theory. It was to show that a woman having breasts and a vagina didn't make her unfit for duty, for responsibility, and for careers outside of the home. And it didn't mean that all the domestic chores had to be for women and girls alone. The purpose was not to pin us down on our biological function, but to recognize it and allow us to be full human beings as biological female. We didn't have to apologize for being female. And biologically female doesn't mean that you have less rights of access to human development. And this was, after some grumbling, I would say, liberating for many men and boys too, as also Duika said, because it's also men who suffer on this kind of worldview, because they also were expected to be manly far beyond the capacity to inseminate a woman, and that's not very convenient for many men as well. So what I feel with this new ideology is that we go back to a stereotyped society in which we may allow more genders, but still the genders define us at all times in all phases and situations of our lives. And that was precisely what we didn't want. We did not want to be gender defined at all times, in all situations, in all stages of our lives.
Thanks, that's so clear. Who's setting the health services agenda, and who are the winners and losers in this? And in your opinion, what's behind this increased medicalization and commodification of human bodies?
You're asking very, very heavy questions here, which really touch at the core of what's happening to our humanity and the way that there is a number of people in power who just want to grab the power. We will say God is dead. We will not have the right to a religious worldview or a worldview other than the worldview that's been promoted. But it means that it's not a human being that is in charge, but just a few human beings who hold the strings and tell the others. So I find this really scary. So I think there is connivance and glee in certain realms where sophisticated science and capital meet. For if you disconnect gender completely from the biological function of a woman and man having a child, then you have free reign over individuals and generations. Beyond and behind the fantastic avenue for lifelong dependence on hormones and anti-rejection drugs and complicated surgery that is not without risks and is very expensive and done with money of the public service, which means that it is at the expense of other pressing needs in medical care. But the procreation, which is borne by couples, it becomes reproduction borne by the fertility industry. So this is how it also disconnects us from our biological roots and from our personal agency, because we will just be like animal husbandry. And I find this an extremely dangerous development. What we see is that the fertility industry is already booming. And if you go to one of their fairs, as they hold them in Paris, you will see that even though they cannot do this in public on, let's say, in billboards, but if you go there, they will tell you, yeah, we can give you a child the way you want. You tell us and we select the embryo for you. I mean, this is just worse than a dog fair where you find the most beautiful dog and buy that dog. I find it just absolutely, totally unacceptable. And I would say that if the erotic expression of sex becomes more important than its biological function, that is, in a way, it was fine. We needed some separation. But if there is a complete disconnect, then we really are also disconnecting from our biological foundations. And I think that really cuts loose from nature. We will not be able to protect ourselves or nature from the greed of some of the individuals as represented in firms that are going to kind of take over into the most intimate of our being. Yeah.
I've got my next question is, as a resident of France, what recent developments regarding gender identity debate have you noticed in the society?
I would say that they're different. There is, of course, the gender debate by the feminists of France, the official feminists. And I noticed there that the concern is strong with the intrusion of transgenders on the space for women. So the feminists defend their space as biologically female, regardless of their sexual orientation. That should not play a role. But I would say in the wider society, but that could be not a prejudice, but a sort of conditioning because of my own NGO. And even though I usually switch off the cookies, they will still find you and feed you what is your center of interest. But I would say that on the whole, women in France and politically also is a strong drive for ever more control over their reproductive function, meaning a longer period of accepting abortion, even arguing that if you couldn't have an abortion because of, for instance, the COVID-19 situation, and you would in desperation kill your child, it would not count as a infanticide, but it should count as a kind of abortion because of the circumstances. So that control over your own body as if it is your own property and your own commodity seems to be more, let's say, talked about or written about. But the official concern of the feminist movement is definitely the transgender intrusion, but also the whole issue of language. To a certain extent, there has been support for degenderization, debinarization of the French language, but of course you cannot do it. I mean, it becomes completely impossible to use French if you abandon the dichotomy between a female and male, which has absolutely nothing to do with male and female in the social sense. So that is a big discussion that divides the society. And the pressure of the trans, the whole movement is to impose this new writing to in schools, but the parents rightfully it's impossible even to learn that. It's too complicated. And as a linguist myself, I say you just completely destroy the French thinking. And I would like to draw to the attention of everybody who's concerned about femicide, which is another big issue that the French feminists are very concerned about, because there is a lot of femicides in France, but they're not always from by men who use French as their mother tongue, but very often committed by men who express and think in languages that do not have this binary structure. So the whole issue of trying to deconstruct our Western European languages for gender, what is it, bias, is in fact a bit of a futile thing if you imagine that most people think in other languages with other think structures where this binary grammatical thing doesn't exist, but they're still quite capable of male violence, male dominance, patriarchy, etc., to oppress women.
Yeah, wow, that is such a good point. Yeah, that's and interesting about how that's playing out in France, and I guess in other countries where the language is so much more obviously gendered in terms of the structure of it. I mean, pretty much everything in French is either male or female, all the nouns, I guess.
Yes, and the word gender just means genus, so it was like in mankind, in humanity, we distinguished in biology two genus, the male and the female, but it doesn't have any other. A genus is a species of tree. That's also a word for it in Latin. So the word has been so, well,
it's very different. Well, the last question I want to ask you is, can you tell us about the funding of NGOs in Africa?
Well, we have two issues that are coinciding here. We are using more and more. There is a discussion of neo-colonial, and in the beginning, I sort of rejected it, having lived in Africa for a long time and have been there at the independence. And I feel, come on, let's go on with things. But there's some truth in it, because at the moment, African NGOs are mostly concerned with fair access to development. Most African countries are developing. They do have an improving economy. If they don't, it's because of rebels, it's because of infighting, it's because of political reasons. But economically speaking, many of these countries have an economic growth far over what the Western world has at the present. But if they want to get access to funds internationally and international approval, they're not allowed to speak about mothers or about motherhood or about whatever it is. They have to go into the gendered language, and they have to give priority over the gendered issues. So it's not something that comes from the bottom up, but it's something that's opposed from outside. Which is why I think it's a neo-colonial thing to impose upon the African development agencies that they should abide by this new way of thinking, which is absolutely not what they what they feel like themselves. I feel very sorry because even international, or let's say African experts cannot work if they are not willing to, well, it's like apostasies that they ask. It's like asking for conversion. I find it very, very disturbing that this has to happen and that they do not have the freedom to think their own way. The agencies that really go for this international terminology about gender equality, etc., they get funded well. So you get more funds to combat sexually transmitted diseases in prostitute communities or sex workers communities. But at the same time, in the rural areas, mothers keep dying in childbirth because there is no proper care, or because the proper care cannot be reached, and because there is no money, and it doesn't take much money and much effort to improve it, but there is no interest. And that is where the African NGOs are, as it were, tied up. So my efforts to get international funding are also stuck there. I'm now planning to create my own little dotation fund so that the team that I've set up, that are truly rural African developers and changers, big changers in the good sense, who want to work for women, to give rural women their space, their right to life, their happiness. And I'm going to make sure that they're not going to be swallowed by UNICEF and UNFPA, and I don't know what, to dance to the tune of the international global trendsetters, but that they can do it their way, and I will there be in the background to support it, because that's what we want. That's where you can listen to the women. Yeah.